Hey, book lovers. Welcome back to Lit Snippets. You know, your quick fix of bookish goodness for those of us who are short on time but can't get enough of great books. And today, we're diving deep into Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point, the highly anticipated follow-up to his smash hit, The Tipping Point. We've got some exciting excerpts here, but don't worry, no spoilers. We just want to give you a little taste to get you craving more, not replace the experience of reading the book yourself.
What's really interesting is Gladwell tells us right away that this book presents a new set of theories, stuff he's been grappling with for years. It's not just a rehash of old ideas, but a real evolution in his thinking over the past 25 years.
You're right. It's like he's been having this internal debate about tipping points all this time. And now he's finally ready to share his discoveries. So how does he approach these new theories?
Well, he uses these captivating stories, almost like puzzles waiting to be solved. For example, he delves into the 1990s bank robbery epidemic in LA, the one with the Yankee Bandit. It starts small, but things quickly escalate.
Yeah, his style spreads like wildfire, right?
Right.
Evolving and getting more organized as other guys like Casper and Sea Dog get involved. It's like a chain reaction of crime.
Precisely. But then Gladwell throws us a curveball. Why didn't Willie Sutton, the infamous bank robber from decades earlier, cause the same kind of epidemic in New York City?
That's true. Sutton was a legend, even had a movie about him. So why didn't his crimes become as contagious as the Yankee Bandits?
That's where the concept of overstory comes in. Gladwell argues that places have their own personality, a set of unspoken rules and norms that shape how things unfold within them, like the forest canopy influencing what grows beneath it.
Oh, I see. So the LA of the 90s had a different personality compared to Sutton's New York.
Exactly. He uses Miami as a great example. Back in the 80s, it was overflowing with drug money. And this culture of casual lawbreaking was everywhere. This environment, this overstory, set the stage for a huge Medicare fraud epidemic later on.
Oh, yeah. He talks about Philippus Forms, that Medicare fraud kingpin, whose own rabbi even argued that Miami's corrupt culture influenced him.
Right. It sounds wild, but it highlights this powerful idea that our surroundings can subtly shape our choices in ways we might not even realize. So think about it. What's the overstory of the place you live in? How is it shaping the trends and behaviors you see around you?
Wow. That's really thought-provoking. It makes you wonder how much of what we consider individual choice
Hmm.
is actually influenced by these invisible forces.
And it's not just about location. Gladwell also digs into this fascinating thing called small area variation,
Yeah.
where things like medical care can vary drastically from one town to the next, even if the doctors are equally skilled.
Wait, really? Like what kind of variation?
Well, he uses this example of tonsillectomy rates in Vermont. In some towns, tonsillectomies were incredibly common, while in others, they were practically unheard of. It wasn't about the doctor's abilities, but rather the subtle differences in local culture and medical
It's
practices.
like these pockets of belief and behavior create their own microcultures, kind of like how certain ideas just seem to cluster in certain places.
Exactly. It's so interesting. He also talks about the consistently low vaccination rates wherever there's a Waldorf school.
You mean those schools that emphasize holistic learning? That's interesting. What's the connection there?
Gladwell doesn't say directly, but it illustrates how seemingly neutral choices, like choosing a particular school for your child, can actually align you with a whole set of beliefs and practices you might not have even considered. It's about understanding those unseen forces at play.
Okay, I'm starting to see how it all fits together. And speaking of hidden influences, Gladwell also talks about the magic third, this idea that group dynamics change dramatically when a minority reaches a certain percentage. What's that all about?
He explores Rosebeth Cantor's research, which found that when a minority group makes up less than 30% of a group, they often struggle to be seen as individuals, their contributions get overlooked, and their voices often dismissed.
He uses Ursula Burns as an example, the former CEO of Xerox. She was often the only black woman in the room, so she had to be exceptional, almost superhuman, to be accepted.
Right. And that's the problem with those skewed group proportions. It puts immense pressure on the minority to perform at an extraordinary level, which can unfortunately reinforce stereotypes.
But what happens when you reach that magic third, that 30% mark?
Everything changes. The minority gains a real voice, their perspectives are taken more seriously, and the whole culture of the group starts to evolve. It applies to corporate boards, classrooms, even society as a whole.
So that makes me wonder, can we intentionally engineer these tipping points? Can we create those shifts on purpose?
Well, that's where things get a little trickier and more controversial. Gladwell examines how some institutions, even prestigious ones like Harvard, use seemingly neutral policies to manipulate group proportions and achieve specific social outcomes.
He's not holding back, is he?
Not at all. He looks at Harvard's admissions process and their efforts to maintain a certain racial balance, raising some uncomfortable questions about their true motivations.
And then there's that example of Harvard adding women's rugby to their varsity sports.
Hmm?
It's a niche, expensive sport. So what's the real agenda there?
It's fascinating. He explores how even seemingly progressive choices can be driven by a desire to control demographics and engineer specific outcomes. It really makes you think.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder. You know about those hidden agendas behind those decisions that seem so simple.
And that's just the beginning. Gladwell goes even deeper with this idea of super spreaders, and I'm not just talking about viruses here.
Right. It's not just about diseases. It's also about how certain people
Hmm.
have this outsized influence on spreading ideas and behaviors.
Exactly. Like, remember that Biogen conference at the start of COVID? One person infected hundreds, and then those hundreds infected thousands more. He compares it to how some people just have this knack for spreading ideas, trends, even bad habits.
Oh, yeah. Now that you mention it, I remember that part about the doctors
Yeah.
who prescribe way more opioids than their peers. That was really something.
It's a disturbing example, right? But
Yeah.
also insightful. Gladwell explains how Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, they actually targeted these super spreader doctors,
Yeah.
knowing that their influence could fuel the opioid crisis.
It makes you wonder how much of what we think of as going viral, whether it's a song or a social movement,
Yeah.
is actually driven by these super spreaders.
Yeah.
Are we more susceptible to certain messages than we realize?
That's a great question, and it leads to an even bigger one. If we know that some people are more likely to spread harmful behaviors, should we do something about it? Do we have like an ethical responsibility to intervene?
That's a tough one, for sure. The slippery slope, no doubt. But I appreciate that Gladwell doesn't shy away from these difficult questions. In fact, he challenges us to think about how we can use this understanding of tipping points for good.
Absolutely. He dedicates a big chunk of the book
Hmm.
to the power of storytelling and how it can completely change our understanding of the world.
I love that part about how the Holocaust, which was barely talked about for decades, became this defining historical event. How did that happen?
It's a powerful example of how storytellers, they don't just inform us, they transform us. He points to the miniseries Holocaust, the one that millions watched in the 1970s. He says it shifted the entire conversation, sparked a wave of awareness and activism that changed the overstory, so to speak.
It's amazing how one piece of media can have such a huge cultural impact. And a little bit scary, too, when you think about it. The responsibility that comes with shaping those narratives, especially around such sensitive topics.
Definitely. And it's not just about historical events. Gladwell also looks at the role of storytelling in modern social movements, like the fight for gay marriage, for instance.
Oh, right. He talks about Will and Grace and how it played a surprisingly influential role. I remember watching that show when I was younger. It was definitely groundbreaking at the time.
Absolutely. Gladwell argues that the way the show portrayed gay characters as normal, relatable people, people you'd want to hang out with, it really helped shift public opinion. It made it much harder to demonize a whole group of people when you saw them represented as individuals just living their lives.
Yeah, it wasn't preachy or political. It just presented these characters as part of everyday life. And that implicit messaging can be so much more powerful than just arguing a point directly.
Exactly. It makes you think about the messages that are embedded in the shows we watch, the books we read, even the stories we tell ourselves. What overstories are they creating?
So we've got overstories, group dynamics, super spreaders, and the power of storytelling. Gladwell is really covering a lot in this book. What else is he going to throw at us?
Well, he brings it all back to the opioid crisis
Right.
and breaks down how it all happened, drawing on those same insights we've been talking about. It's a fascinating read, but also heartbreaking.
I know what you mean. He goes beyond just blaming Purdue Pharma. He looks at all those historical and social factors that contributed to this crisis. It's like this perfect storm of bad decisions
Yeah.
and unintended consequences.
Yeah, he traces it all the way back to California's drug laws in the 1920s. Believe it or not, those laws actually created vulnerabilities that Purdue Pharma exploited decades later.
Wait, seriously? You mean that triplicate prescription law? How could that possibly be connected to a nationwide epidemic so many years later?
It's the perfect example of how things that seem totally unrelated can have these massive unintended consequences. That law, which was meant to reduce drug abuse, it actually shifted the focus of pharmaceutical companies to states without those regulations.
So Purdue Pharma could basically operate under the radar in those areas. That's wild.
Exactly. And they
But
took full advantage, using their sales teams to target those vulnerable markets and flood them with OxyContin. But it gets even more complicated. Gladwell points out this tragic irony. When they reformulated OxyContin to try to prevent abuse, it actually led to even more deaths.
hold on, what? That doesn't make sense. Why would making the drug harder to abuse lead to more overdoses?
Because when people couldn't crush and snort OxyContin as easily, they turned to other drugs that were readily available and cheaper. Things like heroin and fentanyl.
Oh, wow. So they tried to fix the problem
Yeah.
and ended up making it worse? Talk about unintended consequences.
It just shows how even the best intentions can have devastating outcomes, especially when we're dealing with complex social issues.
So after all this, what's the bottom line? What does Gladwell want us to do with all this?
He's calling for a more nuanced and informed approach to social change. He wants us to really understand how events are interconnected, the subtle ways our environment affects us, and the power that individuals and stories have to shape history.
So he's saying we're not just passive bystanders. When it comes to these tipping points, we can actually play a role in shaping them, for better or for worse.
Exactly. He wants us to be more aware of what's really going on, more critical of policies that seem neutral on the surface, and more careful about the stories we tell and believe. It's a big ask, but it's also incredibly empowering.
It's like he's giving us this whole new toolkit to understand and navigate the complexities of the world around us. It makes you want to go back and rethink everything you thought you knew.
And that's what makes Revenge of the Tipping Point so compelling. It's not just a book, it's a call to action.
Yeah, it definitely is a call to action. It makes you want to look at everything differently, to see those connections, and those forces, the ones that are always at work.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those overstories, the ones that are shaping our lives, and those subtle things that influence us, and the power we have as individuals and together to make change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Revenge of the Tipping Point, what's the one big thing you hope our listeners take away from this?
I say it's the importance of questioning assumptions. We often just accept things as they are, whether it's a policy that seems neutral or a behavior that seems harmless. But Gladwell wants us to dig deeper, connect the dots, and consider those unintended consequences.
He's basically saying don't just go with the flow. Be
Right.
critical, be curious, be ready to challenge the way things are.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of stories. The narratives we embrace, the ones we tell ourselves and others, they have a huge impact on the world.
So choose your stories carefully. And if you want to dive deeper into these ideas and really get the full impact of Gladwell's insights, I highly recommend grabbing a copy of Revenge of the Tipping Point. It's a thought-provoking read you won't want to put down.
Yeah, it's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the hidden forces shaping our world and how we can be more aware of our role in the process of change.
And that's a wrap for today's deep dive into Revenge of the Tipping Point here on Lit Snippets. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune in next time for more bookish goodness, all in bite-sized pieces.
Until then, happy reading.